Robert Fisk, war correspondent of The Independent. In the documentary Peace, Propaganda, and the Promised Land, U.S. Media and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, produced by the Media Education Foundation. You can go to their website at pp.2. We'll link to it at democracynow.org. As we talk about media coverage, we're joined by Peter Hart in our New York studio of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, Habib Battah in Lebanon, and Gideon Levy of Haaretz in Israel. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Peter Hart, let's begin with you. Your assessment of the current crisis coverage.
I think there are a lot of things to talk about. One of the first things to understand is that the media in this country are obsessed with a timeline, establishing when history began in this story. And usually in the media, it begins when Palestinians attack. CBS reporter Bob Simon said just as much a couple of weeks ago on the evening news. June 25th, Hamas captures an Israeli soldier. That's when history began. July 12th, Hezbollah does the same, captures 2 Israeli soldiers. That's when the story begins. You can appreciate this history, but you have to ignore a lot of very relevant history. Dozens of Palestinians dead in Gaza in the months prior. The attempt to destroy the Palestinian government in Gaza. The fact that the day before this capture of an Israeli soldier in the West Bank, 2 Hamas members, alleged Hamas members, were captured by Israeli forces in Gaza, crossing that border. We hear a lot of talk about borders and sovereignty being the story, but when Israel crosses that border, it's apparently not a story. The same is true in Lebanon. There's a lot of context to that story that predates July 12th. In late May, a member of Islamic Jihad was killed in Lebanon. Many people in Lebanon and Israel actually think Israel had something to do with it. Border skirmishes have been going on for the past month and a half or so. These are things that are excluded from the timeline. If you read your newspaper, they have a graph, they have a chart. Almost all of them have done this, and they begin on June 25th, they begin on July 12th, and they ignore all of this relevant backstory.
You were mentioning Bob Simon. You mean Bob Schieffer of CBS?
Bob Simon did that. Bob Schieffer pretends that the timeline doesn't matter. He says, this is the Middle East, it doesn't matter who did what. These are irrational people, which is at best lazy and I think at worst downright bigoted.
Gideon Levy, you work for Haaretz in Israel. What is the Israeli press reporting?
You mean the coverage of the war right now?
Yes.
You see, always in times of war, the rules are changing a little bit. And what happens to the entire society happens also to the media, namely becoming more united, more nationalistic, more militaristic, and even more chauvinistic and violent. Same happens here, though I must tell you there is a sense of criticism already now about this war, but mainly about tactical aspects of it. Should we use the territorial option or not? Did the army function well or not? Questions like this are being raised already now. My main criticism about the Israeli media right now is a very old one, namely ignoring almost totally the sacrifice of the sacrifice of the Lebanese people, the destruction, the killings. All this is covered in the Israeli media in a very, very hidden way, modest way, and really out of proportion, so that the Israeli reader is not really exposed to pictures and reports that a European reader is exposed to. This, I think, is not something to be proud about.
I'm going to ask you after break about how this relates to public opinion in Israel, the whole issue of media manufacturing consent for war. We'll also be joined by Habib Battah in Lebanon, who has been watching U.S. media from Beirut. Stay with us. Vibrant here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting on over 450 radio and television stations around the country on Pacifica Radio and NPR, low-power FM college and community radio stations, public access TV and PBS stations, and on both TV satellite networks, Dish Network Channel 9415, Free Speech TV, 9410, Link TV, and also on DirecTV Channel 375. And we're video and audio podcasting at democracynow.org. And our headlines are in Spanish and both audio and in transcript form at our website, democracynow.org, as we talk about media coverage from Tel Aviv, from Beirut, and from here in the United States. We're joined by Peter Hart of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. We're joined by Gideon Levy in Tel Aviv of the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. And in Beirut, we're joined by Habib Battah. He is managing editor of Middle East Broadcasters Journal, a former correspondent for the Beirut Daily Star and Al Jazeera. He recently published a piece in Al Jazeera called Watching American TV in Beirut. Well, Habib Battah, what do you see?
When I'm watching the media coverage here from Lebanon, I'm reminded of the American media coverage. I'm reminded of being in Qatar during the Iraq War, at the beginning of it at least, and watching how the use of sources on American media reflected the policy of the United States government. And those sources are mainly retired military analysts. I was watching a show last night, Hardball on MSNBC, and the three guests were two American generals and a former colonel. So there really isn't a diversity of opinion. These sources allow assumptions to be made that kind of slip under the radar, and these assumptions typically would assume the best of Israel and the worst of Hezbollah. So the conflict isn't approached from an objective point of view. It's approached from a reflection of the policy of the government. Just like the United States government won't talk to Hezbollah, American media, you'll rarely find a Hezbollah source being featured or Hezbollah claims being countered to IDF claims. Just like in the Iraq War, the IDF claims become the main source of information, the sole source often, which misleads that into being really the fact on the ground. We hear the American reporters assume that Hezbollah is using human shields. At the same time, they also assume that Israel has committed all of these massive killings of civilians by accident, and that indeed the killing of the UN soldiers was, as some reporters put it, even before the Israeli government came out and apologized for this. Reporters on some British networks and American networks were saying this was an accident waiting to happen. So that's an assumption, whereas on the Hezbollah side, the assumption would be absolute worse, that these are using human shields. And I just wanted to also mention the tone of the coverage, the reporters' familiarity with Israel and Israeli cities compared to Lebanon. And we see, for example, some reporters describing Tel Aviv as a city that is very, very familiar. It's like a city in California, they said, a very modern city. When an attack is on Nazareth, they'll call it the holy town of Nazareth, the hometown of Jesus. When there was an attack on Cana, we didn't hear that, Cana has a biblical reference as well as being the place where Jesus made wine. There was no identifying with that place. Beirut as well could be described as the city in California in some sense. So that's a real problem in identifying and actually giving more sympathy.
Habib Battah speaking to us from Beirut, managing editor of Middle East Broadcasters. Gideon Levy with us from Tel Aviv with Haaretz. Gideon, what about this issue of how the Israeli media coverage relates to Israeli public opinion? And I'm wondering if today, in your headlines of the headlines and newspapers in Israel, report on this Human Rights Watch report that says that Israel is deliberately targeting civilians.
I didn't see it. I think I saw it in one of the websites, but I didn't see it in the newspapers. But I can assure you, if it will appear in a very small place. As all the question of human rights and all the question of the damages that we created in Lebanon is partly hidden from the Israeli public opinion. Hidden in a way that it does not get the proportional place. Not in size, not in the location. As you know, location is very important in media. So if you mention in the end of a news program 20 casualties, it's one thing, and if you say just in the beginning, it's another thing. The scenes that we see from Lebanon, we see pictures from Lebanon. It's not that we don't see pictures of Lebanon. But if someone wants really to know how does it look like there, he has to move to BBC or CNN or Sky News or one of those international networks, because in Israel they will show again and again our casualties, our sacrifice, which is very natural and very understandable. The only problem is lack of proportion.
And how does it relate